Okay, let's start. This is one of the LaRouche Pack Saturday Evening Class series. I'm Tony Pappert, speaking to you from Michigan. I'm joined by Bob Ingram in California, who's going to be the main presenter tonight. I'd just like to say in introduction, the class could be entitled The Danger of World War III, Where It Comes From, What to Do About It. Now, President Trump has very rightly said that the Ukraine war is heading toward World War III if it's not stopped. And it's true. People are looking for scenarios whereby the Ukraine war will become World War III. Will Russia use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? I don't think that's possible. Will United States troops take the field against Russia? That, unfortunately, is possible. Various other scenarios, and saying, does this scenario produce World War III? Well, there are plenty of scenarios that could produce World War III because US troops, although actually in civilian uniform, are actually confronting Russia in Ukraine, as many of you know. The advanced weapons which are being sent over are not being operated by Ukrainians in many cases, but by US or other NATO troops under civilian or outside contractor cover. So US forces indirectly are engaging Russia. And the first time this has ever happened in that way. At the same time, President Biden is not content, or the people who tell President Biden what to think, are not content with merely confronting Russia. They want to confront China at the same time. But the danger immediately before us of a slide into World War III doesn't arise through scenarios. It doesn't arise through coincidence. It arises through intent. The fact is that the international financial oligarchy, which is otherwise known as the British Empire, and which is the thing which tells this so-called secret government what to do, this modern-day British Empire, international financial oligarchy, is actually trying right now to provoke World War III between Russia, China, and the US with the idea of destroying all three. And this is not the first time this has happened. We went through 2 world wars in the last century, triggered by the same British Empire with the similar objectives, because it's not about Russia or China in the last analysis. It's much more about the United States than it is about Russia or China. Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 2009, this is not the only time he said this, but he wrote in 2009, every major war on this planet since 1865 has been an offshoot of the principal goal of the British Empire, that empire's desperate commitment to bring about the ultimate destruction of our United States. The target of World War I, the target of World War II, the target of the wars Britain launched in the 19th century was not Europe, not China, not Russia. These were all, may have been obstacles, they may have been in the way. The target was the United States. The British launched 2 world wars in the last century for the purpose of bringing down their great nemesis since the 18th century, the United States of America. Now, as we alluded to in the email for this class, Germany's Chancellor Bismarck, in the latter part of the 1800s, knew well what the British were driving for. He knew that the British were driving for World War I, which he saw as a replay of the 7 Years' War of the 1700s and of the Napoleonic Wars of the 1800s. And Bismarck stepped in to prevent this, to stop it, as in a totally different way, in a different situation, President Trump is doing today. So this is a historical backdrop to understanding where the danger of world war is coming from now and how it can be prevented, how it can be turned around. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Bob Ingram.
Okay, I assume I can be heard. Hello, everyone. Back again. So Tony described, in essence, what we're going to be talking about tonight. My presentation is going to be fairly brief, so we should have time for a lot of discussion. People in the course of the presentation can come up with questions or ideas that they want to bring up in the discussion period. Look, what we're talking about is, Tony stated it very clearly, but I'll restate it. We're talking about the question of war or peace, and people have to comprehend where we are at this moment, where the world is at this moment. There are a lot of people on this call, a lot of people all over the country, millions of people who are now engaged in some cases in very courageous fights around a number of issues to try to save our nation. This can range from what's going on in the schools to economic policy to voter integrity to many, many other things. And many of these are not only necessary, but even noble fights that people are engaged in, citizens stepping up to save the country. But what I would pose to you tonight is you have to think through where we are, because this issue of war or peace overrides everything else, every other political consideration. And I don't think it is at all an accident or a coincidence that this is the life and death issue. It's wrong to call it an issue, the life and death reality, the choice we have, which President Trump is increasingly focused on. And we need to be increasingly focused on it. What I'm going to do is begin by reading you a short excerpt from the 4-minute video that President Trump recorded on February 20th, just a few days ago. This is readily available on Truth Social and Rumble and other places. But this was the short video he recorded. It's separate from the speech he gave in Florida. And I'll read you just a couple of paragraphs from that speech. And Trump said, quote, "World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers, the globalists, the deep state, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the national security industrial complex. One of the reasons I was one of the only presidents in generations who did not start a war is that I was the only president to reject the catastrophic advice from many of Washington's generals, bureaucrats, and so-called diplomats who only know how to get us into conflicts, but they don't know how to get us out. These people have been seeking a conflict for some time. We are now teetering on the brink of World War III. A lot of people don't see it, but I see it. Our opponents are candidates of war. I am the president who delivers peace. We could end the Ukraine conflict in 24 hours with the right leadership. At the end of my next 4 years, the warmongers and frauds and failures at the senior ranks of our government will all be gone. So that's all I'm going to read from that speech. And I think, it speaks for itself. And the words enunciated by President Trump there really have to be taken to heart as to what is at stake, not just one issue or another issue. I mean, there are many things like the fight around censorship and free speech, but we have to stop this war escalation. Now, I would point out to people the incredible courage of Donald Trump at this moment. You look at those words or listen to those words that I just read to you, which he spoke, and ask yourself, who else in the world is speaking out in this way? Now, there may be many private citizens who are speaking out, but a private citizen is generally powerless as to, that's wrong, but a private citizen is a private citizen. Ask yourself, who among members of Congress, who among leading political figures in this country, and who among world leaders, any world leaders, are speaking out in this way? And there's no one else. Trump is putting himself forward to rally the people of this country and really to rally the people of the world, because Trump is an international figure, to rally the people of this world to stop this war and to clean out the treasonous warmongers in Washington, D.C. I mean, he is, frankly, voluntarily putting a target on his own back. He is standing up against the British establishment, the national security state in the United States, NATO, the globalists, the World Economic Forum crowd, and he is saying, I'm going to stop this war. And this is an unbelievably brave thing to do. Now, what I also would like to read to you is another short excerpt. On February 21st, the day after Trump recorded this video, on February 21st, Vladimir Putin spoke in Moscow. And essentially, I forget the formal title of it, but this is essentially the equivalent of a State of the Union message. It was his annual address to the Russian people on February 21st. Now, we just published an article on this on the LaRouche PAC website, written by Tony Pappert, my co-presenter tonight. That article is entitled, "Read Putin's Address to See Through the Lies." And that was posted on the LaRouche PAC website yesterday. So it's right up on top of the scroll on that website. And I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs from that article and then a paragraph from Putin's speech, just one paragraph. It was a very long speech. And what the article on the website says, through neocon Victoria Nuland of the State Department, the Obama administration spent $5 billion on a bloody coup featuring neo-Nazi groups, which overthrew the elected president of Ukraine in 2014. Ever since then, the US and NATO have been training and equipping the Ukrainian army to take on Russia, with the promise of eventual NATO membership for Ukraine. During the same period, Ukraine's armed forces have ceaselessly shelled its civilian Russian-speaking citizens in the eastern Donbass region, killing about 14,000 of them. In December 2021, Russia demanded negotiations to bar Ukraine from NATO membership, warning that it would take military action otherwise. But the Biden administration refused to discuss it. While knowingly inviting the invasion, which followed, Biden continued to plan for killer economic sanctions intended to destroy Russian power, preparatory to doing the same thing to China the next day. Excuse me. So that's what's in the article. And now, just just a few sentence excerpt from President Putin's speech in Moscow, where he said, quote, "The Western elite make no secret of their goal, which is, I quote, Russia's strategic defeat." What does this mean, Russia's strategic defeat? What does this mean to us? This means they plan to finish us once and for all. In other words, they plan to grow a local conflict into a global confrontation. This is how we understand it, and we will respond accordingly, because this represents an existential threat to our country. So this is where we find ourselves right now. And as Trump says, we are teetering on the brink of World War III. A lot of people don't see it, but I see it. And anyway, I think that's fairly clear what I've just stated. But again, not to just be repetitious, but people really need to think about this. I mean, you could read a lot of articles about all of this, on the various many dozens of websites. But, a lot of the discussion you see is extremely academic, as if, you're playing a game of chess and where should you move your piece on the chessboard. That's not where we are. This is not a classroom debate. We're teetering on the brink of World War III, and that includes war with Russia, and potentially war with, or likely war with China as well. And I would remind you that one thing Tony mentioned of U.S. troops now in the Ukraine, and the the likelihood that if this continues to escalate, we are going to see U.S. troops fighting Russian troops on the ground in the Ukraine. Now, some of you may not be aware of this, but that has never happened in history. And people have sort of been conditioned first by the Cold War, with the Soviet Union, and then with everything, we've seen since the Bush and Obama administrations, and now the Biden administration, as Russia as our enemy number one. But it is useful to remind people here that we have never fought a war against Russia. In fact, in the 19th century, which almost no one is aware of, Russia was America's closest ally in the world throughout the bulk of the 19th century. And in the 20th century, we fought two wars where Russia was our ally. We have never fought a war with Russia. American and Russian soldiers have never fired on each other. But we're now about to cross that red line. And the implications of this are horrendous, horrific. That is where we find ourselves. Now, what I'm going to do is, and this may, seem a little strange, but I'm going to do it anyway, is I'm going to backtrack and discuss a little bit the situation going into World War I, and also the question of German-Russian relations in the 19th century, as well as German-Russian-American relations. Some of this may seem unnecessary, but a lot of people don't have any of this historical background. So I think it is useful for people to hear some of this. And one of the things I want to start off with, it's not the most important thing, but is to, report to people, well, anyway, to give a little bit of history on the fact that, for over 200 years, beginning with Peter the Great back in the early 18th century, for over 200 years, Russia and Germany were allies. I mean, sometimes they were formal allies. Sometimes they formed military alliances. But even without the military alliances, they had a very friendly, relationship, which lasted, 2 centuries. There were ups and downs to it, but it was pretty straightforward. And it was based essentially on 2 things. One was opposition to the British Empire. And secondly, and you could argue even more importantly, the deep economic ties, the deep economic partnership that developed between Germany and Russia in the 18th century and in the 19th century. Remember, Peter the Great, was the great modernizer. He cut off the beards of all of the aristocrats, but it was Peter the Great who brought manufacturing into Russia, who brought industry into Russia, who brought modern transportation systems into Russia, who brought shipbuilding into Russia. And most of, those technologies and most of that knowledge, which he brought into Russia to modernize Russia, he brought from Germany, from trade deals with Germany. He actually personally made 2 trips to Western Europe. One was incognito, sort of funny, traveled around, tried to hide who he was. And he visited a lot of countries, but he spent the majority of his time in Germany and Holland, visiting their factories, visiting their shipyards, visiting their rail yards. And he actually recruited an enormous number of primarily German engineers, technicians, skilled workmen to move to Russia, to build up the industries in Russia, such that by the end of his reign, 10% of the population of St. Petersburg were German. And this really initiated a very, very close relationship between the 2 nations, which existed throughout the remainder of the 18th century and almost all of the 19th century. Now, later, a little bit later, after Peter the Great, there was the Russian leader, the Russian Tsarina, Catherine the Great. And some people might be aware that Catherine the Great was a great friend of America. During the American Revolutionary War, she was the one, all the way over, in Russia, she was the one to organize the League of Armed Neutrality, which provided great support for George Washington and his army and the Continental Congress during the American Revolutionary War. That was Catherine the Great. What a lot of people are aware of is that Catherine the Great was not even Russian. She was a German princess. Her actual name was, and I'm going to massacre the German here, but her actual name was Princess Sophie von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg. And she was a royal princess of Pomerania, which was a region inside Prussia. And she married into the Russian ruling house, the Romanovs. And then when her husband died, she became, the ruler of Russia. But she was, her 2 primary allies in the world were Germany and the United States. And throughout the 19th century, Russia and Germany were friends, and they were both friends of the United States. During the U.S. Civil War, the Tsar Alexander of Russia, and a lot of people are aware of this, probably not everyone, but during the U.S. Civil War, Tsar Alexander of Russia sent over the Russian fleet both to the West Coast and East Coast of the United States. The Russian fleet landed in New York City, and Russian troops paraded, down, I don't know, Broadway or one of the other avenues in Manhattan. And the same thing happened in San Francisco. And the reason the Russian fleet was there was to protect the United States from attack by the British Navy. Because the British Navy, although not legally, but in reality, in every way you can imagine, the British Navy was, supporting the Confederacy, and there was a real threat that the British fleet might attack New York or San Francisco. And the Tsar sent his fleet here to protect us. Just a couple of anecdotes. Again, they may seem not that important, but it paints an interesting picture. A couple of things about Grant and Russia, Ulysses Grant. When Grant was president, the war was breaking out between Prussia and France. This was part of the unification of Germany, and France was ruled by Louis Napoleon, who was another supporter of the Confederacy, and who also had 40,000 French troops, in Mexico, threatening to attack the United States from Mexico. And a war broke out between Prussia and France, and Grant sent Philip Sheridan, the Civil War general, to Prussia. And Sheridan became both an observer and an advisor to the Prussian army when they invaded France, and actually gave them some battlefield advice. And he was present at the surrender, the defeat and the surrender of Louis Napoleon at the end of that war. Later, in 1878, shortly after, only a year after, about a year and a half after he left office, Ulysses Grant traveled to Europe, and he visited Berlin. He had a lengthy meeting, which has been reported on in this book, I think Around the World with President Grant or something. But he had a lengthy meeting with Chancellor Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, the German leader. Very friendly, very cordial. And then from Berlin, Grant traveled to St. Petersburg, and again had a lengthy meeting and a series of discussions with Tsar Alexander, the same Tsar who had sent the Russian fleet to the United States during the Civil War to help us. So this is what you see here. There was never a formal military alliance with the United States, but there was a partnership, there was a friendship, there was a dynamic between these three nations, the United States of America, Germany, and Russia, particularly after the Civil War. And it was all, it was, and everyone understood that the real threat to world peace came from the British Empire and their partners in Paris, the French. As far as Bismarck goes, Chancellor Bismarck, he was the chancellor of Germany for 19 years, from 1871 to 1890. And he repeated on many, many occasions publicly and privately, very explicitly, that his foreign policy was based first and foremost on friendship with Russia, that this came before everything else. In 1871, he organized an alliance between Germany, Russia, and Austria. And then 2 years later, this became formalized. Bismarck organized a meeting in Berlin with the three leaders of those nations, Kaiser Wilhelm I, Alexander II of Russia, and Franz Joseph, the Austrian emperor. They all met in Berlin in 1872, and they formed the Alliance of the Three Emperors, which was explicitly anti-British. Then in 1878, he formed a new alliance, Bismarck, called the Triple Alliance, with Germany, Austria, and Italy. Now, Russia was not part of that alliance, but this did not mean a break with Russia by any stretch of the imagination. But the purpose here was to draw Italy into this alliance. And then, the relations with Russia remained very, very friendly. And in fact, in 1887, Russia and Germany signed something called the Reinsurance Treaty for strategic, military, and economic cooperation. So you have, at that point, Germany, Russia, Austria, and Italy. Now, there were two things going on here. One was the economic development. By 1879, remember, Grant visited Berlin to meet with Bismarck in 1878. In 1879, Bismarck announced that he was revolutionizing German economic policy. He was abandoning free trade. He introduced the tariff law of 1879, which was modeled on American tariffs. And he began, essentially implementing what you could call, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but he implemented what you could call an American system economic policy, particularly in terms of tariffs and an emphasis on expanding manufacturing. That was 1 year after his meeting with Grant. Also during that period, there was a German economist named Wilhelm von Kardorff, who wrote a book called Against the Current. And Kardorff, who was a leading German economist in the 1870s, was a student of Henry Carey. And in his book, he says Germany must model its economic policies on those of Henry Carey, which is Lincoln's economic advisor. And that is exactly what Bismarck did after 1879. So as you go into the 1880s, you have this alliance, this combination of nations, Germany, Russia, Austria, and Italy, who are forging deep economic ties, building infrastructure, building railroads, developing their manufacturing. But at the same time, it is a quasi-military alliance. Now, it's not an alliance to make war. It's the exact opposite. What Bismarck was doing is he was saying, we're going to create a block of nations here, which combined are too powerful for anyone to attack. They're too powerful, for the British or the French or anyone else to attack us, because militarily and economically, we're too strong. So this is what he did. Now, unfortunately, what happened, and this is very, I'm very quick and very simplified. But unfortunately, what happened was that by 1890, both Wilhelm I of Germany and Alexander II of Russia, by 1890, they were both dead. Wilhelm died of old age. Alexander II was assassinated, but they were both dead by 1890. And their successors, the people who took over the helm in St. Petersburg and Berlin, were pretty much idiots, particularly Wilhelm II. They were just idiots. And they began almost immediately. Well, one of the first things Wilhelm II did was to fire Bismarck. He fired him as chancellor. And then, almost immediately, he began to undo many of the things Bismarck had done. Bismarck's policy had been a policy of economic development and war avoidance. What you might call peace through strength. But Bismarck was fired, and things immediately went off track. One of the first things that happened was that in 1891, 1 year after Bismarck's ouster, and remember, Bismarck said the cornerstone of our foreign policy, which takes priority over everything else, is our alliance with Russia. Well, 1 year after Bismarck's dismissal, that was broken. And in 1891, an alliance was signed between Russia and France. Then that was followed in 1904 by the Entente Cordiale, which was a military alliance between Great Britain and France. And then in 1907, those three nations came together in what was called the Triple Entente, which was a military alliance between Great Britain, France, and Russia, thus having Germany surrounded. Now, unlike the Triple Alliance of Bismarck, which was an alliance aimed at keeping the peace, the Triple Entente was organized as an alliance to go to war against Germany, to surround Germany on all sides, and to merely await the provocation that would set off the war. Once the Triple Entente was signed in 1907, World War I became inevitable. That's exactly what happened. So the fact is, there was no reason, just as there's no reason today to go to war with Russia. In 1914, there was no reason for Russia and Germany to go to war. They had been friends for 200 years. They had cooperated on many things. And the economic ties between the two nations, they were each other's leading trade partners. And the economic ties benefited both countries, enriched both countries, made both countries prosperous. And there was no reason to go to war. But what the British did, beginning with the ouster of Bismarck and then going through to the founding of the Triple Entente, was they manipulated the situation to create the conditions where Germany would be isolated from Russia, and Russia would join with France and Britain, in a war against Germany. And all that took was a spark to set off. And look, if you look at the situation today, what is NATO, particularly as far from the Russian viewpoint? What's NATO except a modern version of the Triple Entente? Except now it's, this collection of NATO member states, but surrounding Russia on all sides and threatening to do the same thing to China. surrounding it on all sides. What have they done since 2000? Well, actually, before I conclude, I'll remind people of the speech that was given by Vladimir Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. This became a notorious, infamous speech denounced by all of the, globalists, warmongers in the West, establishment media, New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. John McCain was actually at that conference. And when Putin was speaking, John McCain was yelling at him and jumping out of his seat, attacking Putin. Because what did Putin say at that speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference in front of all of these NATO and other world leaders? He says, the actions that you're taking now are going to lead to war. And I'll read you a short quote from that speech. Again, it's just 2 sentences. But he said, this is Putin, "I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation which reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended?" And that's what we've seen since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Despite the promise to Russia that NATO would not move eastward, they would not incorporate any new any new nations into NATO in Eastern Europe or from the former Soviet Union. They broke that promise almost overnight. And it has been a steady march of NATO with bases, with missiles, with advanced weaponry, with armies, a steady advance of NATO right up to Russia's border. And the crisis in the Ukraine, as Putin himself stated, was a direct result of the insistence by the United States that they were going to offer NATO membership to the Ukraine. Obviously you have the inflection point of 2014, when British intelligence and US figures like Victoria Nuland and others orchestrated a coup d'etat in Ukraine against a democratically elected government, leading to the launching of a military confrontation. Then you had all of the atrocities in the Donbass committed by the Ukrainians, which Putin has, talked about many, many times. And, this is where we find ourselves, surrounding Russia as Germany was surrounded in 1914, moving NATO's borders, NATO military forces closer and closer to the Russian border. This is, it's not identical. You can't just say this happened and that happened, but it's the same scenario. Russia and then China eventually. Russia is being targeted for destruction, being targeted for subjugation, and NATO is moving forward. Germany is committing suicide. I talked about the economic relations between Russia and Germany in the 19th century and the early 20th century, but that's still the same today. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Russia is Germany's, or has been up until very recently, Germany's leading trading partner. I may be wrong about that, but it was not number one, it's number 2 or number 3. Germany and Russia depend upon each other economically. and Germany is now marching directly into, World War on behest of the, NATO, the Biden administration, et cetera. So, this is all geopolitics. Ultimately, as Tony said, the target is the United States. Now you could say, well, it's the United States doing this. This is what the leftists say. Well, yeah, it is the United States doing it. Although the British are more rabid, listen to Boris Johnson sometime. The British are far more rabid for this war policy than the United States. But, let's not forget, the government we have in Washington right now is a government which stole the election, which is imposing wartime censorship. And the American Republic, the Republic of Washington and Lincoln, is as much, or one could even say even more so, the target of this war drive as Russia, because they want to eradicate even the memory of what the American Republic actually is. So the, it's madness, it's treason. And again, to remind you, the only individual who is actually putting his life on the line, and which is what he is doing, putting his life on the line to stop this, is Donald Trump. He's not saying, like some of these people in Congress, we shouldn't be spending money, to send to the Ukraine, because they're going to waste it. I mean, what a wimpy, half-assed, critique that is. We shouldn't be sending money to the Ukraine because this is a drive to World War III. And that's what Trump is saying. And that's what we need to be saying. And, this has to be raised everywhere, at every meeting, no matter what the topic. Because as Trump said, we're on the precipice of this, and it's not going to go away. So, the British organized World War I, and they're organizing what's going, together with their friends in the US, intelligence establishment. They're organizing the same thing today. So look, that may seem a little dark, but so be it. It needs to be said, I think. And I'm going to stop right there, and we can open it up for discussion. Tony might have something he wants to add before we go to discussion.